this is Dr. Mollie Marti. Welcome to Resiliency Matters. This is where we take the big resiliency research and break it down into small bite-sized pieces that you can begin using immediately to strengthen yourself and others. What if you could learn essential steps toward recovering from trauma? Would you spend the next 28 minutes with us? What if in the next 10 minutes you could get a checklist of adverse childhood experiences and how they can negatively impact a lifetime and what we can do to start helping kids and turning this around? Would you hang out with us? Who is us? Today, my other half is Leslie Wright, Vice President of Community Building for United Way. Leslie has a bachelor's in psychology, a master's in human development, and she leads a team of more than 50 staff and volunteer dedicated to improving wellness. Leslie is a leader in youth building and post-crisis recovery and well-being, and we are thrilled to have her with us today. Welcome, Leslie.
Thank you so much for having me, Dr. Marti. I'm glad to be here.
Welcome again. And you're from United Way, so let's start there. Why is resiliency an essential piece of the United Way conversation?
Well, we've always talked about United Way strengthening communities, and strong communities are built with people who are healthy and resilient and creative. And so how do we do more of that? That's the question that guides us.
That's a good question. And I'm interested in your journey. What fascinates or intrigues you about resiliency?
One of the things that led me to get a master's in human development was my desire to figure out how do you help people tap into their potential. And then when I started working with United Way, and in 2008 was part of the team that responded to the flood, it became clear to me that not everyone recovered in the same way. And I wanted to understand why some people seemed, even in the face of terrible experiences, to actually do well, maybe even be stronger, and others continue to struggle to this day.
And a conversation about why are some people more resilient than others really isn't complete without talking about adverse childhood experiences, referred to as ACEs. So we're going to be talking about these ACEs today. What are they?
Well, ACEs are essentially, the shortest version is what happens to us when we're small shapes who we are when we grow up. And there are about 9 research-based experiences: physical, sexual, and emotional abuse, neglect, having a mentally ill person in the home, having someone who struggles with substance abuse in the family, witnessing violence against the mother particularly, but against a parent, high conflict parent relationships, or incarceration of a family member. Those are the 9 research-defined adverse childhood experiences.
So what happens to children when they experience these ACEs?
It essentially changes the wiring of the brain. It creates toxic stress. When you think about fight or flight, that's what's happening in these little bodies and these little brains over and over again every time they experience some of this extreme adversity.
So it is a cumulative process, or it's called a dosage, right? Just how many exposures there are to these ACEs.
That's correct. In fact, it matters how many and how often. And much of the research sort of sets a critical break point around if someone has had 4 or more ACEs. And once that has happened, you'll find that there are lifelong negative outcomes, and this chart shows some of those. You can attribute more than 50% of someone's risk for HIV to their experience of 4 or more ACEs when they were young. You can also attribute other things you might see happening in people you know, people who have missed days of work. More than 60% of that can be attributable to having experienced 4 or more ACEs. So this has long-term, whole life impact.
So this research really highlights the impact of ACEs. You're in this field, you see it every day, you're working. In your words, why is it important to research this, to understand this, to get our minds wrapped around this?
For so long, we've tried to understand root causes. So what's really at the heart of the issues, the things that ail us as people. And number one, this is spiritual and emotional, physical, mental. It impacts the whole person. But it also has these long-term, whole life negative outcomes. 1 in 4 of people who are unemployed or unable to work have experienced 4 or more ACEs. 50% of kids in the classroom who are identified as having a learning or behavior problem have had 4 or more ACEs. It's at the heart of the things we're trying to change, so we need to understand this so we can figure out how to make it different.
We're going to talk more about something you mentioned, that experiencing these ACEs actually changes how your brain functions. It changes your lens on the world, and there's a very high dissatisfaction of life level from someone who's experienced these ACEs. So we're going to get to that, but I want to really drill down. We have youth builders watching the show, teachers, parents, nonprofits, and can you give guidance on how to recognize if a child perhaps is in an environment in which they are being exposed to these adverse childhood experiences?
Well, certainly people who are close to the child, who know them well, a teacher might know things about their life that give them some cues, but other things you might see is a child who has trouble with relationships. They seem isolated, they have a hard time connecting or recognizing social cues, or they might have a difficult time controlling their emotions. They might have lots of outbursts. They might act like a child who's always at risk or unsafe. You know, these are things that could lead us to ask a child what's going on in their life, what's happening around them. Often we instead react by saying, stop doing that, or what's wrong with you. But instead we need to start to tease out what's going on with a child.
So to start those conversations, we've covered a lot of information. Let's break this down to a takeaway tip for you today. Learn the warning signs of childhood trauma and seek to build a safe and supportive environment within your home, within the classrooms, within your community. How can you compensate for adverse childhood experiences? We'll talk about this when we come back. Hi, I'm Dr. Mollie Marti, and welcome back to Resiliency Matters. Today we are speaking with Leslie Wright of United Way. We've been talking about adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs. And we're going to continue that conversation, but I really want to kind of flip the coin over, because the other side of this coin are the characteristics that develop resiliency and build stronger kids. And we have a lot of research to discuss there as well. So what are some of these characteristics?
Well, what we're looking for is to build kids' skills to be able to bounce back, to persevere when things are hard, to be creative, to imagine they can solve problems. So that's really what we're looking for. And when I was looking for guidance to help me talk about it in sort of everyday ways we could all relate to, I came across the work of Dr. Kenneth Ginsburg out of Philadelphia. And he wrote a great book called A Parent's Guide to Building Resilience in Children and Teens. And he talks about the 7 C's.
I have Dr. Ginsburg's book on my bookshelf as well, and I pull it out as a resource. So let's talk through some of these 7 C's, and let's put all of them up for our viewers. We don't need to cover all of them, but can you talk us through some of these?
Sure, I'll just select a few of them, but competence, really key. It is important that kids, and grown-ups for that matter, can say, I know how to solve this, I know how to work through this, have a sense of mastery. Connection, social isolation, can't say that word. Social isolation has a really negative impact on people. We need networks of support. We need to know who we can reach out to when things are hard. So that's important. Contribution is about, I have something to give. I am a needed part of this community or this group or this team. So kids need to have that experience, and they need to learn how to cope. It isn't about making their life easy all the time, but in fact, allowing them to handle adversity, know they can do it, know that they have help, and control. So that internal locus of control, I have a sense that decisions I make or actions I take can impact what's happening around me, even when bad stuff happens. It's important for kids to know that.
That's a great list. And one thing we try to do at the Community Resiliency Project is take this research and make it usable for parents and teachers and communities. An example of that just kind of puts that list into action, I think, is our You Matter, We Need You campaign. And it really focuses on that connection with their trusted adults, but saying you as an individual matter and you have individual strengths, and we'll help you identify those and grow those, and we're here to help. And then that contribution piece is so healing because as they contribute, they think that they're helping the community or others, but it has a way of strengthening ourselves when we do that.
Absolutely.
So that's a very useful list. You actually are going to even give us more specific tips on building resilience in kids. And when we talk about building resilience, we can be using this context of adverse childhood experiences. But the beautiful thing is, as you try to help those kids, you help all kids, right?
Absolutely.
Uplift. So these tips are really applicable to all resiliency building. So let's go through some of these specific tips.
And what I would just say to begin with is that these are taken from a variety of resources, the sanctuary model, compassionate schools work, a number of things. So these aren't just United Way ideas, these are things we're learning from others. But it's always important to help kids identify what they're good at, what's mine to give, what's my gift. Help kids have the experience of making decisions. First small ones and then bigger ones as they get more able. Recognize kids, acknowledge what they've done well in very specific and personal ways. It is essential to build safety and emotional security where they are. So how does a child know that this is always going to be a good place? And we've talked a little bit about creating opportunities for kids to contribute. So make sure they have a role, make sure that they have some specific task to do. And then as adults, it's really important for us to model positive coping strategies. If all kids ever see is a freak out or a crisis when something bad happens, that's how they'll respond.
And these tips are titled Build Resilience in Children, but I think it's a really important part of this conversation too, to apply them to us as adults, because I know that we have viewers that are in need of healing. We have viewers that experience those adverse childhood experiences, and they can't even get to a point of helping as much until they become whole.
Absolutely.
So what would you say that you've seen in your work from, we talk about building children, but what are those steps toward healing ourselves as adults?
Well, first I would say this. More than 60% of adults have at least one adverse childhood experience in their background. It's normal. It's part of being human. So we need to first start with just knowing ourselves, and also take back that we create our own stories going forward. So it's possible to take that apart, but start with what happened to me, and then build from there, and find all those things on that list. Find the person who encourages you and helps you feel like you matter. Find opportunities to laugh. That's a really basic one. And make sure you're part of a positive network of people. You don't have to be alone. And because all of us go through this at one point or another.
I was just having a conversation with a woman, and she had said, and she had some of these adverse childhood experiences, said, I think I've lost my sense of awe. I think I've lost, I just can't get excited about anything. And again, that's the framework in which she saw things. And so one suggestion I gave her is we all have our phones these days, and she had one, to snap a picture at least once every day of something that you find beautiful, or something, maybe it won't take your breath away. I started there, and she said, I can't even imagine having my breath taken away. So start where you are, but something that you can frame as beautiful, and write how it speaks to you. And as you do that day after day, that's an example of you changing your mind back to that childhood wonderment that perhaps was taken away from you as a child.
I've heard you talk about self-talk. It's connected to that as well. You know, how do we start a different dialogue about the world and our experience so that we actually see something different happening around us?
So let's bring this back. I really wanted to have that conversation about helping adults heal, but let's bring it back to our youth builders that are with us today. One piece of advice, the key piece of advice, where should they start? If they said, you're right, I'm listening to you, I need to do more, I can change a life.
Absolutely.
Where do I start?
The research has shown it's really very simple. One caring adult in the life of a child can mitigate untold numbers of adverse childhood experiences. So if you have that time and that space in your life, become a mentor, become someone who works with just one child, create that positive connection, help them to see themselves as significant, you can change a future.
You certainly can. So there's your takeaway tip for this segment. We each have the ability to save and strengthen youth. Connect with the child, show that you care, and encourage that child to contribute in a meaningful way. 3 factors that help us recover from crisis and grow stronger. When we come back, stay with us. Hi, I'm Dr. Mollie Marti, and welcome back to Resiliency Matters. Today we are speaking with Leslie Wright of the United Way. We've been talking about ACEs, we've been talking about resiliency building, really drilling down to helping children and then healing ourselves as adults. In your work with United Way, you take even a broader perspective, that community perspective. Yes. So let's talk about ACEs, building resiliency, reducing those ACEs in our schools, in our communities. What does this look like?
Well, we're very excited to discover the Gallup research just in the last year or so, which they are very focused on hope, which is a major antidote of adversity. And so we began to understand their model, and it's all based on the work of the Gallup Student Poll, where they have surveyed thousands and thousands, hundreds of thousands of kids to find out how they're doing with hope, well-being, and engagement. Because they believed that these were markers of kids who were going to do well, be healthy, be successful. So that's what we started to look at. And hope is, how we feel about the future. And engagement is, I'm enthusiastic and I'm involved in school. And well-being is how I feel about my life. Do I feel good? Do I laugh? All those kinds of things.
And again, solid research that's incorporated in our Thrive model. We haven't talked much about that Thrive model, but we've covered pieces of it with the trusted adults, the high expectations, the challenge, resiliency building, which we're talking about today. And then Gallup's work really kind of maps onto the IVE, involvement, vision, hope, and enrichment, the well-being. So it's really important work. You work with schools, you work with community programs in growing this. So let's get practical. Sure. Let's use schools as a context. But again, if a parent's listening, they certainly can tweak this pretty quickly.
Absolutely.
Within their homes. But I'd like to make this very practical on hope, engagement, and well-being. So what's an example of an activity that you could do with a child, students, a classroom of children, to build hope?
Well, hope is very much connected to our belief about ourselves and our sense of efficacy. So in a classroom, it's giving kids challenges to help them overcome obstacles, have that experience. And how can you do that for them as individuals and in teams, and show them how to reach out and use resources to overcome things that they may find to be difficult.
Good. And then engagement.
Engagement is about that one-on-one experience. I am known, I am recognized, someone is interested in who I am. So one of the recommendations, and this all comes from Gallup's work, which you can find out there, is, ask kids specific one-on-one questions. What do you like to be called? What are your hot buttons? So this also touches on helping them know themselves. And a question like, who makes you feel important? Asking kids those questions and getting to know them grows their engagement.
And that reminds me, we had a discussion with Angela Myers, and I think one of her resources was the 12 most important ways to tell kids they matter, to show kids they matter. So if you want specific tips, teachers are a great place to go to this, because they get this, engaging those kids. And well-being, what if a teacher or parent wants to increase the sense of well-being? What does this mean, and what's an activity?
Well, again, this is where we also want to connect kids with their successes. So an easy, I call it easy, but it seems to me a pretty straightforward suggestion is, in the classroom, ask kids to reflect on and maybe even write about, what have my successes been? And how do I connect those successes to school? And how do I connect those successes to my future? And begin to imagine forward. That's a real simple activity.
Yeah, and even that process of having a child hold that sense of celebration, that sense of accomplishment. You know, and we do this as adults. I was working out this morning, and on my DVD, you get to the cool down, and she said, you know, you could skip this cool down, but it's not about the cool down. It's about celebrating what you just did for yourself, and to become stronger in all areas of your life. And we tend to give so much away. How much do we just take a breath and go, nice job? And if we can teach our children that, that really contributes to that well-being.
Absolutely.
What are some of the outcomes? I mean, there's some great, Gallup has very striking outcomes, but even say with hope, what is a practical outcome of increasing hope in a child?
You know, what's wonderful about the Gallup research is that it's been all across the nation, hundreds of thousands of kids, and what they've discovered is that hope, how kids rank themselves in hopefulness, is a better predictor of their post-secondary success than GPA, ACTs, SATs, those scores we all spend all our time worrying about. It's that belief in their future and energy about that really is going to carry them where we hope they will go. And so that's why we have worked with our district partners here to implement the Gallup Student Poll in Cedar Rapids.
So I want to mirror that, because that is striking, that more important than test scores, more important than GPAs, more important than those academics, and we hear a lot on the core curriculums and all of those, is that individual child's sense of hope, the energy and the positive attitude they have about their future.
Absolutely.
So that needs to be heard. You have given us so much information today, and you have more specific tips and examples, I believe, to go beyond school in our communities, after-school programs. Let's talk about that. So put up some tips here about what we can be doing in our after-school programs, and why is this important to be looking beyond school?
Well, I think it's most important because Iowa is a state where 80% of children's parents, both or their only parent, are in the workforce. And research has shown us that the gap between school time and parents' work schedules can be 25 hours. So what are we helping kids do in that time? So you'll hear a lot of the same themes, but here's some things that a youth development organization can do. Make sure you've prepared, because structure and routine helps them be safe, help them connect, be calm, and be positive.
Some great takeaways. So here's tip number 3. Build resiliency by increasing hope for a better future, fully engaging in activities, and improving how you think about and experience life. This is Dr. Mollie Marti on Resiliency Matters. Thank you for joining us, and tune in next time on MediaCom MC22, your local programming leader.